As you help other people pursue God, you can really get in trouble if you're not careful about observing appropriate interpersonal boundaries. And that's true in an individual mentoring relationship as well as in a small group. So here are two really important boundaries that you need to be aware of, that you need to observe. The first one is gender. Simply put, don't mentor across genders. Because a discipleship relationship can generate a level of spiritual intimacy which can eventually stimulate an emotional response or a level of connection between two people and could potentially even lead to actions between them. And so just don't do it. At very least, it could lead to false accusations. And so men should not mentor women apart from their own wife. Women should not mentor men. Find somebody else to do that. Somebody else can step in and help that person. You don't have to. There should just be no exceptions to this because of the potential problems that it raises. And then even in a small group setting, a small group leader should never have an individual follow-up conversation with a member of the group across the gender line. And so if you need to have that conversation, bring your spouse along or assign it to somebody else in the group of the same gender, but don't do it alone. And it can just create problems. Now, another boundary that needs to be observed that's also very, very important is the boundary of confidentiality. Whatever is brought up and discussed in a mentoring relationship must stay confidential because what someone shares with you belongs to them and it's their prerogative to decide when and how that would be shared with other people. That's not your right to be able to do that. You see, trust is absolutely essential in a mentoring relationship. If you don't have trust, then you don't have the opportunity to speak into that person's life. And so any breach of confidentiality that takes place is going to undermine, erode, and destroy that trust. So confidentiality is really, really important. Now, I must say, however, that there are some exceptions to the confidentiality rule. Let's talk about those for a moment. The first exception is when that person gives you explicit permission to share with somebody else. If you're talking about an issue and you realize that there's another person who really needs to know that maybe you can get some help from this other person, then that person you're talking to gives you specific permission to tell that specific person. Like maybe you need to tell the pastor, talk to the pastor about this to get some advice. You ask permission, and if that person agrees, then you can break the confidentiality within the boundaries of that permission. Now, the second exception is when the person threatens harm to themselves or to others. If there's a clear immediate danger to that person, maybe they're suicidal, or there's a clear immediate danger to somebody else, then you have to break confidentiality by notifying the proper authorities. In this case, the safety of persons is a higher value than confidentiality. The third exception is when the person reports knowledge of child abuse or child neglect. If you receive information from a third party that indicates suspicion of child abuse or child neglect, then you're required by law, there's a mandatory requirement for you to report that to the authorities. Again, the safety of a child is more important than confidentiality in this case. Now, I don't know that there are legal requirements to report other kinds of crimes, but you may feel ethically bound if you learn about something that's criminal from a third party. You may feel ethically bound to report that to the authorities as well. And then the last area of exception to the confidentiality rule is when a person reports their own sin that might affect other people adversely. Now, this one's a little bit more of a gray area, and there's going to be some difference of opinion about it. But what I'm talking about is, for example, when someone in a counseling or in a mentoring relationship might tell you that they're stealing from their employer. Now, that employer probably should be able to know that. Or a man might disclose to you that he's having an affair. And so you would encourage that person to talk about that themselves, to go to the wife, to go to the employer. But you might also feel ethically required that you need to go and tell the wife or tell the employer if that person isn't willing to do that. And so you could say something like, I would be happy to sit down with you when you tell your wife about this. And some people might go so far as to even say, and you've got 3 weeks to do that, and if you don't do it, then I'm going to tell her. And the reasoning behind that is that that kind of disclosure is really necessary for the repentance and restoration process to take place if a person is serious about living a life that honors God. Now, there's one other category that someone might tell you something in confidence where you're not required to report it, and that is if someone reports his or her own crime to you. If you're acting as a spiritual leader or a confessor of any kind, then that conversation is covered by what's called clergy privilege. And that means you are not allowed to disclose what has been shared with you. Now, I don't know what the laws are in every state, but in the state where I live, that includes not just pastors, but anybody who's representing the church, even as a volunteer, who has a religious function or a spiritual function in the life of that person, or who is expected or thought by that person to have that function, representing the church, whether you're on the pastoral staff or not. You're not allowed to disclose that confession. Now, if you hear about child abuse or child neglect from a third party, then you're mandated to disclose it, even if you also heard about it from the perpetrator, him or herself. That's where these laws kind of get confusing. But you know what? Even if someone confesses a crime to you, you're not allowed to disclose it. It certainly is appropriate for you to strongly urge that person to go to the authorities themselves, to come clean with that themselves as part of a process of repentance. Now, you can see how these things can get a little bit complicated. So it's important for you to know when to get help from a pastor or a professional, when to refer this to them. And your pastor or your small group coach can help you sort out some of the difficulties related to these laws and these rules. But the big point here today is that as a spiritual mentor or as a small group leader, you're going to get yourself out of a lot of trouble if you just simply observe these two main boundaries in your interpersonal relationships. Number one is gender boundaries, and number two is confidentiality.